film opens with an episode of the famous 1977 game show To Tell the Truth, in which 3 contestants claimed to be the legendary Frank William Abagnale, disguised as airline pilots, lawyers and doctors. He revealed how he tricked people on 3 continents out of millions until they were 19. Frank was asked who caught him, and told the name of Carl Hanratty. The film cuts to 1969, when FBI agent Carl Hanratty arrives in a French prison to extradite Frank Abagnale Jr., who has the flu, and is trying to escape but falls ill. Too heavy to even get out of jail, Frank gave up and asked Carl to take him home. The film then flashes back to 6 years ago. Frank Abagnale Jr. lives in New Rochelle, New York with his father, Frank Abagnale Sr. and French mother Paula. Frank adores his father and is proud to have been elected to the Rotary Club of New Rochelle's Wall of Honor as a life member. One morning, Frank's father picked him up from bed. He took him to a store, where Frank watched as his father persuaded a woman to lend him a black suit. Frank Jr. Frank then drove his father to Chase Manhattan Bank, wearing a suit and pretending to be his driver to impress bank employees and get a loan. When the loan was rejected, the family was forced to move from their mansion to a small apartment, causing tension between Frank's parents. Frank then attended a public school, where he showed up on his first day in his old school uniform. When he heard someone in the class make fun of his uniform as he entered the class, saying it made him look like a substitute teacher, Frank went to the front of the class, pretended to be the substitute teacher for the new class, and even saw him off. A real substitute teacher claimed there was a mistake. The ruse goes on for a week before Frank is found out, and his parents are called in to discuss the matter. While his mother is upset by this, impressed by how far his son could go with the con. One day, returning from school, Frank catches his mother having an adulterous affair with his father's friend Jack Barnes. His mother tries to buy his silence, but Frank is too upset to care. Soon after, Frank returned home to find that his parents were getting a divorce. When asked which of his parents he wanted to live with, Frank used his checkbook to run away from home, looking for transportation and shelter. When Frank ran out of money quickly, he tried to make fake checks out of his checkbook, and then tried to fool the bank teller with little success. One day, he noticed several airline pilots and flight attendants were checking into a hotel. Frank was encouraged to see them being treated as VIPs wherever they went. Pretending to be a college student, he reported on Pan Am and interviewed a senior Pan Am executive and a former pilot to obtain the Pan Am pilot's uniform and learn more about it. Frank then used his uniform and knowledge to create fake Pan Am checks, which he successfully cashed at banks and hotels across New York. Even the bank manager who rejected him earlier fell into the scam, which worked. Frank tries the same airport security scam, but is confused by the expected death of the pilot heading for Miami. Frank flew with him and experienced his first flight, followed by his first sexual experience with a flight attendant. In Miami, Frank learns valuable information about routing checks, while publicly flirting with a bank teller. He then purchased a check encoding machine at an auction to carry out his plan and create extensive checks. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty, a barely humorous but aggressive FBI agent, investigates Frank's check fraud. To Carl's surprise, he traces the latest forged check to a hotel. Carl Hanratty Frank was found still living there and broke into his room to arrest him. Coming out of the bathroom in a suit, Frank only knows that Carl is from the FBI, and Frank pretends to be a U.S. Secret Service agent, Barry Allen, and brazenly claims that he caught the suspect before Carl showed up. It wasn't until Frank escaped the room that Carl realized he had been tricked. Following the encounter, the information in the room and Carl's description bring no clues, and fingerprints collected in the room lead nowhere. In another interview with Pan Am executives, Frank learned that he had amassed several nicknames, such as the Skywayman and the James Bond of the Sky. Inspired by the title, Frank bought a Bond-themed suit and an Aston Martin, which he drove for a walk. Soon after, he meets a magazine model named Cheryl Ann at the hotel where he is staying. She offered to spend the night with him for $1,000, but Frank claimed he only had a check for $1,400. Cheryl then asks him to approve that she will pay him the remaining $400 in cash, causing the girl to pay Frank to sleep with her. Frank soon tries to use the stolen money to find a way to reunite his divorced parents. He invited his father to a fancy restaurant and gave him the keys to a brand new Cadillac. Frank Sr. explained that he couldn't accept the gift because the IRS was still monitoring him and Paula refused to talk to him. A few months later, on Christmas Eve, Carl was working alone in the FBI office, and Frank called to apologize for cheating on him at the hotel. Carl refuses to accept the apology and invites Frank to meet face to face. Frank tells Carl his location and room number, but Carl doesn't believe him. As the conversation continued, Carl quickly realized the reason for the call. Frank had no one else to talk to. Frank hangs up angrily, and Carl continues his investigation with renewed vigor. Later, Carl discovered that Barry Allen's name was a Flash comic character, and suggested that Frank might be a minor, which explains why they couldn't find any records of him or match his fingerprints. Recalling Frank's mention of the New York Yankees on the phone, Carl ordered his men to check the New York area for breakthroughs. Their search eventually leads them to Frank's mother, who has remarried Jack Barnes. Carl recognized Frank immediately after seeing a photo of him in the yearbook, and finally knew who his suspect was. He then told Frank's mother that Frank had stolen about $1.3 million in check fraud. Sometime later, while visiting a friend in an Atlanta hospital, Frank meets and becomes interested in a young hospital nurse named Brenda Strong. He enters the hospital, pretending to be a doctor with a fake Harvard Medical School diploma and an impressive resume. He was hired as a nighttime emergency room administrator and ensured Brenda was on his staff. Despite having no medical knowledge or experience, Frank could influence his staff's medical interns to step up and make medical calls on their own, so he could handle the administrative side of things without touching patients. Eventually, he wins over Brenda, and the two fall in love. After finding out that her parents had disowned her when she had an abortion in the past, Frank attempts to help her reconcile with her family by proposing to Brenda. Meanwhile, Carl visits Frank's father, who publicly refuses to give up his son. However, Carl found a letter from Frank with his Atlanta address. The address brought Carl and his team to Frank's home, but Frank had already traveled to Louisiana to meet with Brenda's parents. Carl does notice Frank's Harvard diploma and Frank's new alias, which takes him to a hospital that Frank has already checked out. Frank and Brenda met her parents in Louisiana, and Frank not only claimed to be a Lutheran like them, but was also a qualified attorney and doctor. Brenda's father, Roger, asks Frank about his feelings, and Frank publicly admits he's not a lawyer, doctor or co-pilot, but Roger thinks it's just a romantic speech and agrees to send his daughter away. Frank also passes the bar exam and joins Roger's law firm as an assistant prosecutor. As wedding preparations continue, Frank returns to New York to visit his father and tell him about the engagement. Frank Sr., now an employee of the U.S. Post Office and still battling the IRS, told his son that his mother had married Jack Barnes and left ultimately, much to Frank's heartbreak. He also revealed that he had been visited by the FBI and knew what Frank was doing. Frank desperately asked his father to tell him to stop, but Frank Sr. encouraged him to keep going. Furious that his father couldn't act like his father, Frank said goodbye to Sr. Frank called Carl at the FBI office on Christmas Eve, who was waiting for the call, and had his team eavesdrop. Frank said he was done and settled and asked Carl to stop following him. Carl told him it was impossible because Frank had already stolen about $4 million. Frank understands and hangs up, not realizing that what he said to Carl about the engagement was wrong. Carl, who had previously found Frank's alias in Atlanta, concluded that Frank had to keep the same name when he moved to Louisiana, because he was dating a girl who thought it was his real name. After reading the wedding announcement, Carl and his men tracked down Frank on the night of the engagement, making Frank confess his true identity to Brenda, before escaping through the window, and asking her to meet him at the local airport for a few minutes. However, when she arrives as planned, Frank is saddened to see Brenda being closely watched by some disguised FBI agents, which Frank easily made. When Frank didn't show up, Carl ordered his men to spy on the airport, deciding that Frank would try to show up somehow and escape on a plane instead of leaving the city more quietly. Frank runs a new program in which he plays a recruiting pilot for Pan Am, attends a local university, and recruits flight attendants for a trip to Europe. He held auditions, selected the hottest girls he could find, and dressed them in uniforms. He then went to the airport and moved around the crowd, treating the girls like a wall of eye candy, ultimately distracting the agents from looking at him. Frank managed to bypass Carl's men and escape to Europe. 7 months later, in 1967, Carl told his boss that Frank had been forging checks all over the Eastern Hemisphere. Only this time, the check is genuine. He claimed Frank was entirely out of control, and asked permission to track him down in Europe. However, his superiors denied him permission because if Carl couldn't catch Frank in the US, he wouldn't catch him in Europe either. Carl refused to give up and gave one of Frank's counterfeit checks to a professional printer, who concluded from the quality of the check that it must have been printed on a specific type of printer, available only in a few European countries, France being one of them. In an interview with Frank's mother, Carl recalled that she was born in France, so she travels to Montrechard, her birthplace, and finds Frank printing thousands of checks at a large printer on Christmas Eve. Carl told Frank he was coming with the French police and promised they would arrest him personally. Frank thinks Carl is lying, but Carl convinces him that he will be shot if he leaves the factory without Carl. Frank agrees to handcuff himself, and Carl takes him outside without seeing the police, who praise Carl for his ability to fool him. However, French police arrived almost immediately and escorted Frank to prison, with Carl promising to extradite Frank to the United States. 2 years later, Frank was released into Carl's custody. On Christmas Eve, 1969, Frank's plane was extradited to the United States. As they prepared to land, Carl informed Frank that Frank Sr. had died unexpectedly the year before. Frustrated, Frank locked himself in the plane's bathroom before escaping the plane to find his mother's house. His escape leads them to the Barnes residence, where Frank finds his mother, happily married to her second husband, who now has a young daughter, whom Frank realizes is his half-sister. With his father dead and realizing his mother has moved on, Frank quietly surrenders as Carl and the local police arrive and arrest him. Frank is finally tried, convicted, and sentenced to 12 years completely isolated in a maximum security federal prison in Atlanta. During the next 4 years, Frank regularly visits Carl, especially around Christmas time. During one of these visits, Frank quickly identifies a forger Carl is chasing, after glancing at a check that Carl casually shows him, giving the FBI agent an idea. Sometime later, Carl revisits Frank, only this time with his boss. They give him a check which he aptly identifies as fake as soon as he touches it, which makes Carl smile. In 1974, Carl arranged for Frank to be allowed to serve the remainder of his sentence, working for the check fraud department of the FBI under Carl's custody. Although Frank is out of prison, he is chained to his desk job and misses the thrill of his old life. When he stumbles upon a pilot uniform, Frank is tempted into posing again as an airline pilot. As he's about to fly away, Carl meets him at the airport. Carl allows him to go free, predicting that Frank will return to work on Monday, since no one is chasing him anymore. Back in the office on Monday morning, Carl is nervous when Frank doesn't show up for work on time. However, Frank does show up, and the two begin going over a recently discovered check forgery that shows some new methods of fraud they haven't encountered before. As they look over the check, Carl asks Frank what has been on his mind for years, how he cheated on the Louisiana bar exam to become a lawyer. Frank claims he didn't cheat, studied for 2 weeks, and passed the exam on his own merits. Carl inquires whether this is the truth, but Frank prefers to focus on the case and presses on. It is then revealed through scrolling text that Frank has been happily married for 26 years, had 3 sons, lives in the Midwest with his family, is still good friends with Carl, caught some of the world's most elusive money forgers, and gets millions of dollars each year because of his work creating unforgeable checks. Thanks for watching the whole video. If you enjoy it, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more exciting movie recaps. Bye bye.